shall we say welcome again to Amalia and to Boaz for part 2 of this intriguing serial. This intriguing serial of, is there a theory to Jewish liturgical music? Now, last week, they exposed to us what people were thinking about it. And today we're hoping that we're going to hear their own views. So we're all ears, attention, and looking forward to hearing. So I'm going to pass over first to Amalia.
Thank you, Geraldine. I think I have music playing in the background. Just a second.
Okay, so even the speakers can have distracting music, but always not.
I'm sorry about this. It's beautiful music, but not relevant to Ashkenazi liturgy. So it will have to wait. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Modim lesimcha. I apologize for my voice a little coarse. I'm catching a cold as the hours pass, so I apologize for that. So this is, again, a wonderful opportunity to talk about a topic that might be dry and theoretical for some, but very live and I feel important for anyone who was interested in traditional Ashkenazi prayer and its history and also its future. So what we're going to do, we're looking, last week we explored the previous attempts to form and describe the theory of Ashkenazi liturgical music as they appear in writings from the end of the 19th century and along the 20th century, writings of figures as Avraham Tzvi Edelson, Eric Werner, Joseph Levine, and Baruch Cohen. What we could identify clearly was the tendency to present the theory of Ashkenazi liturgy, of the music of Ashkenazi liturgy, as a collection of scales. Basically, that's what we saw. And as such, many very different musical phenomena were put together as if they belong to the same group or the same category, but essentially this type of categorization did not help us to decipher how the system actually works or what are the governing principles of these scales and how they are translated into actual davening, actual prayer or organizing the sound. Besides the scales, we saw musical motifs that were presented in these writings, also as defining the modes. But again, examining the abundant amount of motifs does not result in a clear definition of how the system works or how it works differently in different cases. We saw that motifs alone, of course, are not enough. Maybe to clarify this point, I'll just give 2 little examples. If we talk about an upgoing fifth, yes, ba-ba, choose any notes that you're comfortable with. So these 2 notes could be an opening motif for a variety of prayers in different modes. It could be Nishmat Kol Chai or Yishtabach Shimcha. It could be maybe with an additional note at the beginning. Befi Yesharim Titomam, yes, tararam, or lead to a totally different place. Vaychulu Hashamayim V'Haaretz V'Chol Tevam. Or if we add the third between the 2 notes of this fifth, it would be Uvechem den bachdecha Adonai Eloheinu al kol maasecha, etc. Or if we take a totally different context, still in the Ashkenazi shul, in the trope of the Torah, if we take a pasuk, a verse from Bereshit, Ve'aretz hayta tohu vavohu, hayta tohu vavohu, da da da. Again, this upgoing fifth. So that's just one example. Remember, we talked about how the same motif can be a completely different creature if you take into consideration its immediate musical surroundings and the context. Even a more clear motif. It's not only two notes. Let's take something like, let's say, do, fa, sol, la, ba, 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 ba. That could be a part of a mode that will be heralding an ending of a paragraph. Asher nishbati be'api, for example, or in a different version of the same Kabbalat Shabbat, it would be that's what the Carlebach version of Kabbalat Shabbat. Or in a different mode, the same motif, ba, 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 could be leading from one mode to another. For example, moving from Ishtabach or from Havaraba into, or what we call so far Ishtabach or Havaraba, into a temporary modulation to the major. Yes, Ishtabach Shimcha Malkeinu, and then Lehodot Leshabeach, or Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam Keshem Shemakdishim Oto. So this very motif can have completely different functions in different surroundings. And in addition, there are extra musical components that we also need to take into consideration when we want to define how the system works. And that's, of course, the relation, text-music relations, the kind of event, what time of the year, what time of the day it is, etc. And different relations that the different modes have with these extra musical components. What we did see as one of the classifications that we did see that Baruch Cohen presents, we found as useful as a starting point in presenting how deciphering the system could work, or at least we're going to take one case study, which is the mode Magen Avot, and Boaz will very soon show what he's been doing with this mode, how he could define what defines it, how it works. We're going to look deeply how this mode works, and it's going to be a case study, not exactly in the maybe traditional sense that we can do the same exactly. We will see the same thing in other modes, but this kind of theoretical analysis can be done also on different modes, on different areas of the tefillah that are not Magen Avot, which is Friday night after Amidah. And we will see maybe other things, but you can see from what we're going to present now, what's the way, what's the method, how to work by and understand how the modal system works. It is not final, but it will give you an idea where we're going and what would be a good way to go by. So Boaz, please.
I just want to add something to what Amalia just said. First of all, these motifs that she mentioned, it's not only whether each one of them functions in a totally different way in context and how it speaks to the other motif, so to speak, but some of them, in certain situations, you may hear it, and it's not one of the defining traits of the mode. It's just something that there is a freedom that the Chazan can just sing up, erase 5, and it's not defining anything. It's just something that they do. So sometimes these things function as the Lego blocks of some mode, and some are not. The other thing is that on the other hand, and the other side of this cone, of this coin. When we looked at the sources last week, one of the problems was, first of all, yes, there were so many motifs, we couldn't find anything in common, but these motifs themselves sometimes were a whole phrase or a whole line, and again, we didn't know if where it appears. The other people did not mention it, and if this whole line is part of it, or some of it is part of it, some of it is not. And the result is, yeah, that there is so many that we have nothing to hang on to except for the scale. But before I go into the details, there's a few general comments that I wanted to express, particularly in view of the discussion that came up after the talk. Again, some of this I'm repeating the obvious and is sort of a little oversimplified, but I think it needs to be restated. The theory is basically about what and how, not about why or when or comparing to this or comparing to that. And the critical understanding has to be that we cannot really deal with any of the why and when and comparing and this and that before you really pinpoint in pretty exact terms what the theory is. Because first of all, if you don't have the entire picture of the theory, you won't be able to answer those questions correctly. And also, while you're trying to do it, you'll get a theory that doesn't work if you try to do both at the same time. By the way, that's what we saw last week. They wanted to show that from the Bet HaMikdash, they wanted to show that it's similar to Makam, that it's Talmud. I mean, all of this together, or that they're similar to other modes, etc. And you can't do that. You have to first look at the stuff, try to see how it works, and then you can start comparing it. That goes to the idea of splitting and lumping that I said before. Again, the phenomenon as a whole is one thing, but in order to understand it, we have to take it apart and look at each component separately. And when you have a clear view of what it is, then you can define the whole thing as an aggregate of interconnections among all these particles. So again, if you want to compare to other musics, again, you also have to define what the other musics are, but the theory has to come first. At the same time, you can, if you want to know what the Chazanim did or what they did not, or you have an idea about this, or we don't know, or what musical component they were aware of, what's not, all of that can be answered after we have, maybe not be able to answer it. But if we try to explore this while trying to build a theory, both pursuits will suffer. On the other hand, I don't think it's the right stance to just view it sort of as the whole and see that there are a lot of different things, and then decide that the aspect of theory, can it even exist? I mean, the question is legitimate, but I think that, again, if you pose it because there's so many different sources, historical factors, outside influences, Romanian, German, Polish, etc., and there's so many things to factor into this that you just can't, and it's not there. First of all, I have to repeat it, there is no unified theory of everything, despite what Joseph Levine wanted to do. And the whole thing, it is one theory, but it has a lot of different aspects. And again, we have to figure out what that is before we just give up and we say there are all these things, so there is no theory. And again, before you say that, that's my take, I guess. And that's what I want to present to you, at least one case here. Before you're saying that and then give up, you don't do it before you actually get into the stuff, into the whole thing, and take a good look of the details of what there is. You can't just say it's just not going to work before you explore it in detail. The same thing that happens about scales. I mean, yes, the problem with the previous attempts is that they all sort of eventually de facto just define it as a scale. But that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily have scales, or that they don't play a different function depending on the context, or maybe they're just limited, and also they might be pushing the envelope of what a scale is. But again, and I'll show you one example here, but again, no preconception, you can't presuppose certain things we always come to something not as a clear slate. We always have some things, but to try to minimize them before we actually look at the stuff. So even in terms of scales, just before they didn't work there, doesn't mean that some of them don't exist and they don't play a certain role. I guess the starting point, the methodological starting point, or the conceptual, is that we're talking about various degrees of freedom. And they could be, there's extreme spectrum from no freedom at all, even so far as the text and the music, like this particular motif, and it's a motif, it doesn't have any variance on this particular word. That's it, you have to do it. That's the most extreme, up to, a whole section of do whatever you want, and everything in between. There's a lot of different ones, and the degrees of freedom are both in terms of a lot of factors, but here I'll just concentrate on two. In terms of the text, what the parameter of the text is. It could be the place of a word in a sentence, the place of a sentence in a paragraph, how many syllables you have, or whether this one is a comma or this one is a full, a period, etc. Those are all plugged in different degrees of freedom. The same thing about the musical parameters. Sometimes the freedom is in terms of pitch. Sometimes they're in terms of use this tetrachord. Sometimes it's an interval. Sometimes it's a part of the ambitus. So long as you're here, etc. So each time, even the degree of freedom controls or refers to one specific parameter. And this is my segue, I guess, into not calling them motifs. So you shouldn't call them motifs for two reasons. First of all, motif is already taken in Western music to present something very specific, and not only the thing itself, but how it's dealt with, how it's developed, etc. Secondly, because of the degree of freedom, and that's one of the problems in all the tables that we saw, we can't really present a motif because the degree of freedom denote that we don't really have a motif, we have a variety of variants that we can use. And this is probably the segue to what I call motif type. In principle, it's not really, should not be called a motif type, it's more like a motif, a proto-motif. But for now, for all the reasons, I use motif type. And before I get into the explaining the details, let's try to do it intuitively. So if we go to what we used to call Adonai Malach, I'm not explaining the details. This is what graphically represents these different motif types. For a start, I'm going to go into detail of two of them, but for starters, I think just intuitively, you don't need to understand what they are. I'm going to have you listen to something, and Eli Schleifer, we know what the source is. The source is questionable, but I'm using it because it's a great example. It's correct. In terms of ethnomusicology, I don't know how to assess it, but it's a very good demonstration of this. And so this is from Kabbalat Shabbat. Just listen while I'm going to point each time which motif type we're about. Try to see if intuitively you can sort of make the connections. I think you could to a large degree. Let's go.
Arboim shonokud bedor Oy mar Antoyel vovhem Vhem Lo yodeu deruchoi Asher nishbati veyapi Im yevoyun el menuchosi.
One more.
ישמחו השומעים וסוגל אורץ, ירעם היום, אם לא יום. יעלו סודי וכל אשר בוי, אז ירננו לפני השם קיוו לשפוט אורץ, ישפוט תבל בצדק, ימים במנוסוי.
Okay, I need to turn it off before it starts to...
כי יעטו השם עליון על כל אורץ, מאוד נעלסו על כל אלוהיקים.
Okay, it goes on. I am sharing the screen, but can you see? Hold on. Yeah, except that I can't see. Let me just a second. I'll get back there. Okay. I think you got at least intuitively what I'm talking about. And again, these are not motifs. These are basic instructions for variants. I'm going to go over two of them more specifically because they are a good example of what motif type is and how it defines the degree of freedom. What I call a D here, if I were to describe it verbally, is do whatever you want, so long as the structural notes, and are 5 and the 7. You can have an upper neighbor with a lower neighbor, but do whatever you want. Degree of freedom, middle. So long as these are structural. What structural is, I don't want to get into much detail, but it's important because there is always a textual aspect, and the primary marker is that those are the accented vowels of the text, but there could be other reasons that are in place. Sometimes there is a suggestion of a bar line and a meter, and there will be on the accented. Sometimes it's just like the regular music theory of knowing what's passing note and what's not, but the textual aspect is crucial. And in order to do that, I want to show you one example of what those variants could be. And this is the Camp Rama, perfectly legit. This is from Kachko, and this, and you can do, there's a lot of different variants. What they all have in common are these are the structural notes. Here, by the way, is an example with a semi-rhythm meter musically, not the text, because you have sort of a suggestion of a beat, and the first part of the beat is accented. It also goes with the text in that particular case. So this is what that is about. Again, this is not a motif, this is a motif type. In other words, the basic instructions of what the minimal requirement to do different variants, and by this definition, it also defines the degree of freedom. In other words, these are the minimal requirements. If you follow them, you have the freedom. If you don't, you are probably either just singing something else, which is totally fine, but it's not a building block of the mode. And there also, of course, like in every case, we have in-between cases that it's a matter of how we conceive them or how the performer goes about them. And again, one person interpretation might be different from the other. That's the fuzzy part of it. The next thing is this, and I remember that there was a comment last week about comparing it to Romanian music, etc., using the term, I think, I don't know if she's here, she used the term gypsy mode, I think. There are lots of different names for this. Ukrainian Dorian is usually what we use in the context of Jewish music. They sometimes call it altered Dorian, raised fourth scale, gypsy scale, Dorian, sharp 4, and even in Jewish music, in the historiography, they would call it Ava Rachamim Steiger, Misha Berach Steiger, etc. The point is, first of all, in general, Ukrainian Dorian doesn't, again, as a rule, doesn't appear by itself. It's usually a detour from somewhere else, not just Abnai Malach, could be from minor, etc. Blah, blah, blah. But the point is that it's not really a scale of its own, especially not here. This is just a pentachord that, yes, if we look at the pentachord, and this is the one of the pentachord, it sort of portrays the lower pentachord of Ukrainian Dorian. The point here is this is not going somewhere. This is just one of the things that the mode does. And the degree of freedom is basically indicated here. Basically, do whatever you want. Just use these notes. You don't have to use all of them. Preferably, if you don't use the augmented second, you lose the point because that's the real characteristic. But basically do anything you want, so long as you're using these notes. Most of the time, this would serve as the structure. Either you go from there, or you end there, or both. Again, if you notice that the fifth degree is very dominant everywhere, it plays a different role in each one. We'll go into this when I discuss the scale a little bit. But here is an example, and again, Amalia mentioned some of these modes are really by the norm of the classification. In other words, each one refers to a certain liturgical time, occasion, circumstance. But Adonai Malach is the exception because we don't have one rule to govern everything. That one goes through the liturgical repertory in different places. So here is an example from Vodak from the Kedusha. This one I'll have to sort of sing. I'm going to do the bottom. Echad hu Eloheinu Avinu Malkeinu. Now watch out. Or the Osya. And then etc. In other words, he does that, and then he goes with Adonai Malach. I'm not trying to identify the motifs here, but here you see that this is the opener, this is the recitation, this is a D, this is a D, and this is a Ukrainian Dorian, and etc. So again, Ukrainian Dorian, so to speak, is a note collection, usually the pentachord, which is used, it's just one of the motif types. So from here, I guess I can just move on. Again, that's where it is. Now, let's talk about the scale for a second. It's a good example of what scale is or not and what it helps. This particular scale was mentioned and written, documented in 3 different places. Well, it doesn't matter who they are, but in all the situations, there were already an exception to something, and one of them I can mention because it was Avineri, who I consider is the first scholar in the current paradigm in which we really try to figure things out without. He had his own preconceptions, but fewer, and he actually mentioned it as something that we need to discard. In other words, he already did not accept it. It actually was a starting point for something really strange that he did, but that's later. And yes, we can see that there is a periodic repetition of a major pentachord, and that what kind of drove him to have a theory that I'm not going to get into. First of all, but we know this is not the scale. To start with, this part of the register, just I'm saying it doesn't exist. And that's one of the problems of the scale, because if we think about a scale, there is sort of a built-in assumption that what's going on here is we can also continue below or above. And this is not the case. It's something that's hard to wrap around our heads around, because in this repertoire, it's not that first of all, we don't know what's here, but the actual idea is there is nothing there, and there is nothing here either. This is just a marker of the range, possibly a range of a layperson, and these are the notes that he sings. He used to, and she now sings within that range, and or ambitus, we'll get there, and that's basically it. Now, let me show you a few of the problems. First of all, again, we cannot even use it as a scale per se. First of all, this top does not exist. It does not. There is one specific occasion, a document that I saw somebody actually using it, and it was a transcription of Amalia. Was it Rosenblatt? Yes.
Yes, Rosenblatt. Yes.
It's not a recording, but it's a transcription. And at the equivalent place where this is, I saw a whole bunch of different things, and I can't even really articulate them in music, in other words, in pentachords or tetrachords, because it's not clear. These, when he got there, these are the options that you can do. In other words, first of all, free for all, you can do just a lot of things. Secondly, none of them is similar to that pentachord, that's tetrachord in the original scale. And so my assumption, I can think about two things. This, I think the most sensible one is just this doesn't exist in the repertoire. So Rosenblatt was able to do it because he's a virtuoso and he has a high range. So if you want to show off, or if you want to elaborate, then you can go there, but it's not, the mode doesn't really contain it. And while you do it, of course, you can do whatever you want. The other idea is exactly the opposite, that because it goes there, and the higher it goes, there is a whole degree of freedom. Then if you are a virtuoso, you can go there. I think that the first assumption makes more sense, especially because, so far as I know, I can only run into one example. And again, this is not, you can't really define it as scale or not tetrachord or anything. Moreover, if I really want to express this as a scale, this is what it would look like, because we have to take other components into account. And so, first of all, these brackets indicate different tetrachords, pentachords, and even triads. And if I were really to do it, then I would have to sort of do this, but here as well, because it's not just ascending. I would have to have this sort of line out of which come all sorts of different things, just like here. And this is, of course, crazy, but also we don't know if it's part of the mode. But basically, this looks, if you want to call it a scale, be my guest, but it's sort of pushing the envelope of what a scale is. And more importantly, it doesn't really help us understand the mode, because this is basically an extraction or putting in tetrachords or pentachords terms what this is. And this is much more helpful. I mean, I could make sort of different tetrachords and pentachords that are these, but what really happens are these motif types. But going back to the scale, it still helps us. So you see, this is much different from the monster that I showed before, but the monster is the true picture, although not helpful and perhaps not even a scale. But here, at least we can use it as, it's a graphic representation. We don't have to use it as a theoretical construct, but let's look at it as a graph. And the graph shows us two things that are interesting and important, because they do express themselves in the practice. But before I do that, first of all, we'll see that even as a scale, we have to take into account this note has a completely different function from this. This is a different function. Every one of them, I can really pinpoint what they do in the mode, but they do different things. Moreover, they do something. In other words, if Mozart sonata in F major, there is no particular road to 2 or 3 or 4, but here there is. And again, there is no repetition of the octave, of course. And yeah, even the same octave pitch class, there is no pitch class. This is different from this is different from this, etc. And the other thing that we can see is that the reason that this one is natural, this one is flat, and this one is flat, and this one is natural, etc., is because we have different things happening in different parts of the ambitus. We have ambitus, I don't have time to explain it, but the reason is, like, in this ambitus something happens, here something happens, but it's different. So among the differences also not E natural, but E flat. Here something happens, but it's different from what here, etc. And the other important thing is that if you notice, and here we're using Western theory, but let's not forget that we still have that cognition, because no matter what, we still feel that as sort of a gravitational center, which in this case I'm not ashamed to call it a tonic, with the understanding that we don't have triadic harmony, we don't have harmony, but let's call it one, but I think it's more than one. In some modes, we have a sort of a Western feeling of a gravitational pull that pulls us towards a note. That's a fact. That is a tonic in other contexts. But we also have other notes. I'll get to that in a second. But if we take into account that this is your one, then from here to here, again, the note collection is identical to C major. Remember, this is the tonic. These are the notes. We're just in pure major. Whereas when we go to the other extreme, this is the note, but here we have a pure minor, to the point that I can give you a key signature of minor, B flat, E flat, A flat. That's just pure C minor. Granted, most of the stuff happens here, but what it does tell you is that the higher you go, the more minor you will sound, to the point that if you get here, you'll sound like minor. And Cantor's can, and at least one example do, use it probably intuitively. One of the things is to use it when you actually do have to modulate, because modulations occurs normally when you go from one liturgical section to another, and the other one is done in a different way. Let's say, even in Kabbalat Shabbat, we do the Tehillim in major, but before we go to the other, that's not a classic example, but there is a norm that you end before Lechadodi, you end in minor. So, if a cantor wants to do that, all she has to do is go up. Now she's in minor. If she's a soprano, she might sing that, but I don't recommend it. And when she goes down, she just forgets to go back and remove the flats. In other words, you go up here, you're in minor. You go back here, this A, you just keep the minor, the flat that was here. When you go here, it's no longer E natural, you just keep the E flat, and there you go, you made the modulation. So it almost serves as what we call a pivot point to go from one scale to another. The other thing it's just an interesting example, because there are some traditions in which specific verses, a specific stance, batim, specific paragraphs in Lechadodi are sung in minor. It's a tradition, it's not everywhere, but there's some traditions that do that, Mikdash Melech, for example. And so a Chazan doesn't necessarily have to go to minor and leave the scale. They just go up. And they sing the beginning, or this whole paragraph, they sing it here. And when they want to go back, they can use this as a pivot, and back they are. And so this diagram of a scale helps us understand it. It just conceptualizes. It's basically just graphics, but it's useful to a certain degree, so long as we realize that the scale has its limitations. What we saw before doesn't work. We have these other things instead. And here, I think, yes, we're moving to the next section, because here I'm moving to real examination of one case in Magen Avot. Before I ask if Amalia wants to say something, let me again repeat what she said already, and we'll repeat it again. Every particular situation is different. This is the good case. I'm using this as a case study of one particular approach that if you look at the detail, you cannot say there is no theory. You can say all of things, but there is so much evidence that at least we discuss it in music theory terms. And again, you should not assume that other parts of the repertoire behave that way, but we already know that some of them do, and some of them do in different ways, but it's an approach, how to at least not stand outside and say, there is too much information, and I don't know if there is a theory, and because I don't know, I'm not willing to explore it. I'm willing to explore it. You get into the nitty-gritty. So Amalia, something before we move on, either that I forgot
Yes,
or that you...
thank you. I just want to add a small methodological comment to whoever wonders what's the basis of creating that the previous slide you showed of that collection of motifs that define Hashem Allah, for example, and soon we will see what you've done with Magen Avot. The work is done on the basis of many written sources and many versions of the tefillah, mainly written, but also some ethnomusicological work, some documentation of life, current tradition. So it's important to understand that this is not theory created on its own. It's based on, not exactly a reduction, but it's a kind of reduction of examining many sources. What we're going to see now, Magen Avot, is maybe a kind of extreme case where there is a very high degree of unity. Is that the right word? In the sources. You can see very much the same thing happening in terms of the motifs and the way they function. And that solves, that saves us the trouble of thinking of different versions, which one is more basic or more part of the defining motifs and what is just another variant. So examining Magen Avot, which is what we're going to do now, really is a representation of what you can find in a large majority of the cases. Yeah, let's just go into Magen Avot, and that will be, I think, clear.
While at it, I want to say one more thing. Yes, because there's sometimes several traditions, there are also the factors, and again, because I'm doing splitting, I chose Magen Avot and Adonai Malach because they're easier that way. I know, again, it's a recursive process because you start with an assumption, but then you can verify it. And one of them is that the Magen Avot really, I can say, I mean, it basically works the same way no matter what sub-tradition you're looking at. Granted, there could always be one that's completely out, but then it's not representing the norm, I guess. And I said before, every source covers not, and there's no one source that can cover everything at the core. There's always some sources that not. Also because in this case, there is not a particular concern about written sources as opposed to recorded or performed, because the current practice in America and Israel is also pretty unified. It's a little different from what I excerpted from the written sources, but it basically does not present a problem as a again, we don't know what to do. Granted, they have a specific relationship to the core, they have a relationship, they have a conversation, but again, and I prefer to define the core in this case by looking at the written sources and then try to sort of compare them to the practice, and in this case, it's very easy. Adonai Malach was also easy because again, Adonai Malach is cross-repertory, it's not just one thing, but no matter what sub-tradition, personal variant, east, west, south, whatever, when it's there, it behaves the same way. The differences could be in the small details, depending on the resolution, or in in this community they don't use it for whatever, but in that one they do. Or when they do it, they treat the degrees of freedom differently, but it's basically the same mode, so to speak. So those are easy. Other ones I acknowledge are not that easy, but if you start with this, you can maybe know what to do in the other cases. And so this is from Ephros Ontology. I chose it here in retrospect, not because it's anything important about Ephros, but I know, again, it's the best representation of a core. Why it's Ephros that way, I don't want to, again, we don't get to the why before we check the what. But I already checked the what, and I have some guesses about the why. They're not relevant right now. I'll just sing it. ויכולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם, ויכל אלוהים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה, וישבות ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה. ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. Very familiar to all of you. I'm sure it's not surprising. Again, as Amalia said, it's very uniform. Note that I did not follow the rhythm whatsoever or the bar, because again, there is an issue with the written sources. We'll get to it in one example. But there's some aspects that might play a role, and I will show a few places where meter does play a role and rhythm, but the exact how to read, that's a little hard to extract from written sources, but we still have live sources, etc., that we can actually, fill in the blanks. Judith Frigishi wrote 2 articles about this. It's excellent. It's besides our focus right now. Except that to say that in the control of the system, there are not just pitches and text and other extra musical, but there is an interconnection to aspect as meter and rhythm, but they need a little bit more examination. And so here are the motifs, but those I'll explain. A, the degree of freedom is really low. Basically, it acts as an opener or a sentence. Does not necessarily, it certainly it always opens the paragraph. The first sentence is always this, but then you can use it to open other phrases or not. The freedom is that you can use it or not for others. For this, you have to. There is no freedom. It's basically 1-5. I'm considering even taking out the third because that was my own sort of misconception. or just bias or a blind spot to just assume that and didn't listen carefully. It may or may not be there. I mean, most of the sources don't have it. In the practice, it's hard to tell because people might hit it. But the degree of freedom is almost zero. You have to do this. You have to do 1-5, and it has to be on the word Vaychulu. The only root freedom I guess you have is a little rhythmic. So here there is not much freedom. And again, the musical parameter is an interval. And scale degrees, again, or from 1 to 5, plus no degree of freedom because it has to do with Vaychulu, the word itself. This is the classic recitation tone. Again, with recitation tone, we have a little bit of a problem because how many notes constitute a recitation tone? And we have to take into account that if you compare to Latin or even English or German, Hebrew has the words are much shorter. We have very few syllables in each word, and so perhaps we have to take into account fewer notes in order to do that. Avinari, if I recall, said 3. I prefer to look at it again as a textual issue. In other words, either it has to cover a whole word or part of one word and part of the following one. Again, it's very flexible, has to do with our cognition, perception, etc. This is a puzzle. And
Boaz, 1 second. Maybe it's worthwhile clarifying that we're talking about the section in the liturgy that we call Magen Avot, which means right after Amidah of Friday night. I said that before, but maybe just to clarify that the rules that you're talking about now, they refer to different parts of this section. From Vaychulu, there are 4 sections, 4 paragraphs from Vaychulu up to Mekadesh Shabbat. And what you're talking about now will be specific to different parts. Or you're talking only about Vaychulu, maybe you should just say that when you refer to one section or...
Okay, this is already doing the recursive process, but fine, yes. We'll tell you the end of the story. It basically covers that particular section, which is the quasi repetition of the Amidah. In other words, it's what the Chazan does on Friday nights instead of not repeating the Amidah on Ma'ariv.
I think that this is clear. However, when you say motive A has 0 level of freedom, that's when it's applied on the beginning of the first paragraph, on Vaychulu. It does not apply in the other 3 paragraphs, even on the one called Magen Avot.
Yes,
Am I right?
Yes, but we will talk about the other paragraphs as we approach them. What is important for you not to think is that those things apply only to Magen Avot. Recitation tones and pausals appear in a lot of modes, I call them modes, in a lot of those modes, especially the ones that are closer to this particular model. So we do have them, and again, it depends on what degree that they will define the mode. If, for example, in Magen Avot, I didn't see much, but I mean, if people want to a recitation tone on 2, which I never heard, it will be fine, but that's part of the freedom they can take. It's just not one of the building blocks of the mode. Let me go to the go back to this fermata business. Oh yeah, that's where it starts. The puzzle is also a textual issue because it's not a matter of a longer note, although it probably would be longer. It's a matter of the textual aspect, which basically parallel to, let's say, a comma and a period. If a sentence has sort of a stop in the middle, that would be a puzzle, and at the end of a sentence. Again, it doesn't have to be there, but if it's there, it functions as a puzzle. And I want to again do something about understanding the rhythm meter, especially when we're talking about recorded written sources. Here is Vaychulu, and you see that the first line, it's from Zulzer. The first line has 5 fermatas, like the first 2 bars, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are not puzzles. These are just a way for Zulzer to try to compensate for the fact that Western notation doesn't quite fit the way we do it. And the indication, this note should be a little longer. Just a little bit longer than a third, than an eighth note, just a little longer, etc. This one, by the way, no, that's not a puzzle either. Because text-wise, it's not a place where you put a comma. But again, so those fermatas are not puzzles. So again, I guess I repeat it. Puzzles are not a matter of meter or rhythm or length. They're a textual issue. And again, when we go to Magen Avot, the puzzle is 5. Then there is a specific way in which we approach the puzzle. And here I actually covered all the degrees of freedom because there are a few, but not too many. So long as you approach it in one ascending step progression, that's your limit in terms of the freedom. Now, you can use it, you can use two. V'chol tzeva'am, 1. Or v'chol tzva'am, or v'chol tzva'am, or v'chol tzva'am. All of this are fine, but this is the minimal requirement. Step progression up. And this I marked as a deep ram because I found out sometimes there is what I call a frequently occurring variant. D1 is perfectly fine as an approach because it has one step. In other words, before the one step, we don't care what you do. That's your freedom. And of course, you can also do that. But it's a particular niche of this repertoire, which I don't want to get into. Again, this is the why and the who and the comparing, but that they use this. And that's a particular variant. This one also, this motif talks to other motifs in the repertoire, but again in Ava, we also use it, but in different ways. But again, this is just one specific variant of this. Here is E, which is maybe sometimes a problem. What it is, if I were talking in Western terms, it's taking the A and copying it into the relative major. I prefer to say taking an A and copying it on 3, because yes, we have an element of a major, but you know, all minor go to relative major. That doesn't make it a Magen Avot. What makes it a Magen Avot is that it does it this way. And here I'm keeping the A because yes, there are sources that do it. So it will sound like Vayecholu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tzeva'am. Vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i, Vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i, etc. So we copy this to the 3rd degree, and if you notice the recitation, we can also copy it into the 5 of the relative major. In terms of textual function, this is also an opener, but it's an opener of a continuing phrase. First of all, this one is already taken by no freedom, and secondly, even in the other sections that we'll see, you don't start with it. It could be any section that happens later. And again, the recitation will be on 5. When we consider a recitation or not, we'll see. This is another motif from 5 to 8. And actually, there's not so much freedom. 5, 8, that's it. And again, the textual connection is a little bit more free because it's basically an opener, but it's an opener of a later phrase. Normally, and again, I wonder if there's a cognitive issue here, and I don't want to commit to its function as that. But mostly when you hear that, you know that it's going to an end somewhere. It doesn't have to be the end of the paragraph, but it could be the end of the middle of the paragraph, etc. So Vayishbot, Bayom Hashvi'i, etc. There is, and again, in addition to the pitch element, we do have a metric issue here. And you remember that meter is not just 3, 4, 4, 4. It's accented versus not accented. And this motif, this will always be the accented syllable. This will be the upbeat, so to speak, the unaccented, and this will be the accented. And rhythm, this will always be shorter than that. Exactly how I show it, what notes, that's 3. But again, unaccented, accented, short, long. What comes after, that's misrepresentation, and I have to say, in my first attempt, I noticed something that towards the end, there is a tendency for something to sort of go up and down. And so I marked it as an H, as a zigzag, so to speak. Marsha probably heard it in class, but the point is this. If the degree of freedom allows for passing notes in between, then it's meaningless, because all music basically goes down and up and down. So it cannot be just, that kind of motion in terms of... So initially I thought this has to be a pure zigzag. In other words, it doesn't matter what the notes are, as you see, but the contour is important. And it's always a zigzag from one note to the next, up, down, without anything in between. And again, this is the recursive process, because then I had to go to check again, and I saw that was not exactly so. I have, as an anecdote, I have to say that earlier classes in the Jewish seminar, which I kind of taught that, and I sent students to sources to find it, they came back with a whole bunch of zigzags everywhere, and they were right, because every music is zigzag. It made it meaningless, so I had to think about it. What I found out is basically, this is not it, and I don't have it in writing, so I'll use my hands. Basically what it denotes, again, the freedom is because only the contour is actually given. It means that you have sort of what I call descending waves. You have waves of going up and another one up, and in between you sort of drop. You drop an interval. You can also drop one step, but it's basically these guys. And another effect, but all of them, some of them can go above the others, but the overall line or contour is down. In other words, we have one step like this one could be higher, this can be lower but very close, and then again and again and again, so long as the overall line is down. Which leads us to not the last. When we approach the tonic, and pay attention that I call it a tonic, necessarily not the end or finalis. The approach to the tonic is the opposite of the approach to the pausal. In other words, a step progression going down. You can go down one step, 2 steps, 3 or 4. Asher asa. Asher asa, Asher asa. All of them are possible, but the minimum requirement is this, and this is how you approach to the tonic. J is the approach to, I guess I'll call it finalis, shamelessly, even though I'm borrowing a term from somewhere else, and I do eventually explain the difference from church, etc. But this is the final note of not just the section, but each of these paragraphs, so to speak. Originally, they were not paragraphs. So, but the approach to the, first of all, the finalis is on 5. And the approach could be either like we approach a puzzle, like here, Bara Elohim Lasot, or Elohim Lasot, which is sort of corresponds to this, but again, we fulfill that section, but this becomes more of an idiomatic to go from the 1 through the 4 to the 5. It also converses with other parts of the repertoire that I'm not going to elaborate here, or Lasot, or Lasot, like here, or Lasot, and Lasot, etc. You see that most of them, in other words, they allow for skips without the step progression, but it normally involves the 8 and the 5. And if not, then you can involve other, if you use other step progressions. This actually shows you again that this note has a very different function from this, although they're an octave together. With that, I'm going back to the ephros. No, that we saw. These are the fermatas. Again, you can see that there is 3 fermatas here, a lot of fermatas, not puzzles. Here is back to the ephros with the motifs marked. So, Vayehu, we have, by the way, it puts the emphasis on who, which is wrong, but that's the point. Or no, he says Vaychulu, so that Vaychulu, we have an A, 1-5. Vaychulu hashamayim veha. We can look at this. I think it's a recitation, even if we don't take that into account. But I think this is one of the cases where that's an upper neighbor. The way we hear it is still a recitation. Vaychulu hashamayim veha. We still hear it as a recitation, even though we have that one. It's approach to the tonic. You see, it's not the ending, but it's an approach to a tonic. V'chol tzevaham, step progression to puzzle. Vayechal Elohim bayom, recitation on 5, that's a B. Ashvihi, got the E. Vaykadesh, this is a good example of only 4 notes, but they do sound like a recitation, again, because we don't have enough syllables in Hebrew. Yom HaShvi'i Vaykadesh, we have a full Vaykadesh and E of the P. That's good enough. Vaykadesh Oto, again D. Vayishbot, that's the jump from 5 to 8, and here we see those waves. Vayishbot, Vayom HaShvi'i, Mikol Rato, Asher Asa, Tira, Tirare, Para, Taram, Tarara, and then approach to the time. Again, Vayevarech, that's the starting with the 3rd degree, Vayevarech Elohim et Yom, recitation on the 5 of the major, Hashvi'i Vayevarech, another recitation, D and C. Note one thing, we copy to the relative major the A, and that's the E. We copy the B, which makes an F, but we don't copy the D and the C. In other words, you don't hear, you don't hear that. That just tells you that it's just separate Lego blocks that you put in different ways. The same thing, again a dikivo, and this motion, and approach to the tonic here. One distinction. Here we have, I told you that this is the tonic and this is the finalis is basically on 5, with one exception. In the first paragraph of Al-Khulu, I didn't do the statistic, but it's not necessarily 50-50, but some end on the 1 and some end on the 5. Amalia, I don't think we have time to explain. There is, some of you know that the first paragraph of Al-Khulu is sort of distinct from the other ones, in the sense that it's a biblical quotation. I'll show some of the things in a minute. And in terms that we actually do it at home too, in the introduction to the Kiddush, etc. That could be the reason that there is a difference here. Again, that goes already into the why. But I first established the how. I established that this exists. Now, I'm skipping the second paragraph with the bracha, just for reasons of time. It basically has these things, motif types, and then
Boaz, just a second.
I'll get to the normal performance.
Sorry. No. Yeah, that's where we're going. I just want to clarify, because maybe the pace is a little bit quick for everyone, so, or to some of us. So maybe we need to just clarify. So what we saw now is a kind of a chart of the motifs that were found after searching many sources. And this is how you see the recursive process of starting from a text, a musical text, searching in many other texts, coming back with the motifs, and then this is when you see a text like Ephos, then you understand why it's very close to the core, because there's so many other variants. And just a second, wait with that. And that becomes an emblematic example. So this is a good example of how you do Vaychulu, and almost all the other examples that you will find will behave in a similar way, even if there will be so many more notes. Now, what Boaz just started talking about is when you take an overall look on Magen Avot, on that section of the liturgy, you can see also rules that apply in that mode that apply to the entire section. So there are some things that are typical to Vaychulu, and then we have 3 other paragraphs where other things happen. So maybe you want to continue from that. We're going to skip the second paragraph, which is bracha. And then comes Magen Avot. Maybe you want to continue from there.
And I just have to go back a step. Well, first of all, I apologize. I realize it goes a little fast, and I think because we're trying to fit in the whole as much as possible into this limited amount of time. I know that Geraldine tells us to take our time, but yeah. So Amalia, if that's needed, then go right in, and I'll still be a little fast. I'll try to slow down if I can. Here is an example of actually, first of all, what Amalia is referring to is basically what I would say is meta-analysis. It's not really a it has an aspect of meta-analysis, plus just a comparative outlook at the sources. And again, the way I actually extracted those motifs, it was a long process. I didn't assume anything at first until I saw patterns. This one, I just want to use it for 2 reasons. First of all, to show you some of the sources. Again, not all of them are here, because some of them they still follow it, but these follow it in exactly the same way. In other words, we have an A, B, and then we have a C and D. The same thing, but now Levanovsky. ויחולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם, or Khan, ויחולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם, etc. They all behave not just in the same motif, but the same way, the same Lego blocks, I would say, but the same way they put it together. And again, we don't find that strictness or uniformity in other, we find it every once in a while, but not to that degree. And it helps us in two ways. First of all, it helps us a very clear way in music theory terms of how this works. And it also helps us separate it from other, I guess, liturgical sections that there are modes for that. This is also, again, I'm just showing it. I'm not going into the detail of this phrase because it's a little tricky in how they use the different motifs. But again, a lot of sources here. There are 9, there are 10. Again, for each example, I chose only the sources that use it this way. But there are other sources who still use the mode in just not the same phrase. And finally, there is another example of the last phrase, the ending phrase again, and we see a lot of sources that basically do it that way. So now on to the next paragraph. Yes, the second paragraph, again, it has these motifs. It has two particular things that it does that are unique. And again, one of them is an option, and you don't have to follow it. Again, it's a matter of how they use a certain motif. There is one thing that happens as we go through. The degree of freedom becomes a little higher. You can have more freedom. The reason for that, in addition to, I think, the natural tendency to start strict, and as you move along, you start to make more freedom, and that basically happens in a lot of the modes or the musical conduct that I looked at. But here it also has to do with another aspect that we have to incorporate into the theory, which is what I call norm of performance. I'm not getting into the definition, but it has to do, for example, that this Vaikulu, you hear that it's sort of what we'll call straight davening or simple recitation. Another norm would be a congregational singing of tune in unison. Another one could be the cantorial, I call it the cantorial rhapsody, in which the cantor burst into an aria. We used to call it recitati. There are all sorts of other ones. There is a responsorium. There is the Chazan starting, congregational mumbles, and then Chazan finishes. This mumbling itself is what I call a heterophonic chant mumbling. All these things also plug into the interconnections of the theoretical aspects. And so the freedom here is either the cause or effect of the fact that we change norms of performance. If Vaychulu was sort of a straight davening simple recitation, the Magen Avot Bidvaro, the Me'en Sheva paragraph, is very consistently a congregational tune in unison. Now, the indication, how I know it from the score is too details to show, but trust me, I mean, in every source that I saw, I could see a clear indication that they want to do it in a congregational singing on unison as a tune. And of course, in the practice, this is where it matches. We usually, in America, they usually do Magen Avot Bidvaro, which I think is, what's his name?
Goldfarb.
Yeah. Or they do the Lewandowski, which I think is more popular in Israel. Magen Avot Bidvaro Mechayeh Metim, etc. There are other etymological concept observations that we can make because it was written as a metrical tune, but they actually don't sing it metrically. But anyway, this is the norm of performance. The result of which is if you're going to create a tune, you sort of have to take more freedoms with the motifs because you cannot, basically it's hard to build a tune just using these motifs. So you have a degree of freedom that's higher. Actually, in one class for the students, I asked them to compose using the tunes, and we were very successful. In other words, I have to take back, it's difficult to write a tune, it's not, but again, if you want to think a tune, the motifs are not your first concern. First concern is the normal performance for that to have a tune. The result is some freedoms. Let me see what's next. Okay, now I have to go back to norms of performance because there are clear indications that the Vaychulu paragraph has to be sung congregationally. The musical evidence is that it's sung as a metrical tune in unison in the Magen Avot paragraph. The textual sources, and this is from the Tosafot, It's Eben Yachi, I think he was Rashi's grandson, and he's actually doing an interpretation of Psachim, about talking about what happens on Pesach if it's what happens on Friday night if it's on Pesach. So you really have to go to Pesach to find out something about the repetition of the Amidah on Friday night. And what he says, I'll translate in English a minute, וכן כתב אבן יחי והוסיף שיש לאומרו בקול רם ומועמד לפי שהוא עדות להקדוש ברוך הוא שברא שמיים וארץ ועדות מועמדת דכתיב ועמדו שני אנשים. Basically, he says this: you can, first of all, you have to stand up when you say it, and you cannot say it alone. If there has to be at least two people, you have to sort of not the cantor alone, and they interpret everybody, because basically that paragraph is actually a testimony that God created heaven and earth. It's a testament, and if you say a testament, first of all, you have to stand up. Secondly, it's not enough to have one person, and from that, the normal performance sort of has to be congregational in the Vaychulu, in the first paragraph, although it's very different from the way we do the seven, the Mein Sheva, the Magen Avot. And the practice, I think, and Amalia knows in Israel, I think that the most common practice, in America, they just would sing it congregationally. And probably in Israel sometimes too, but there is also a more traditional way of doing it, which is either the Chazan starts and stop at one point, and the congregation then mumbles the whole thing, and then the Chazan picks up and sings the rest of it. I think that there is also, for some reason, I recall a tradition where it's like Modim Anachnu Lach, the Chazan sings it, and the congregation sort of mumbles it or sings it lightly with him, something like that. The evidence that we have in Nehemiah is that this is from Nehemiah. It's a nice sort of documentation of the practice, and Amalia thinks there is just one way to interpret it, and I tend to now agree, which is, he says, he gives you the first Vaychulu paragraph until Kol Tzva'am, and then he says, Kahal, Vaychulu, 3 dots la'asot. In other words, the Chazan sings this, and then he says, the congregation sings now from Vaychulu ad la'asot, the whole thing, and then it says Chazan, and the Chazan repeats it in basically straight davening, so to speak. So it's not a unison congregational tune in meter, but they still fulfill the need to do that. In other words, we have different norms of performances, and we have them in different textual connections. So, the last thing, I have to do this, which I usually don't like to do. Then we have to talk about the final paragraph, which is Retzevi Mnuchatenu. Here, the freedom comes from another norm of performance, which is what we call recitative, but I really prefer cantorial rhapsody for reasons that I'm not going to share now. The point is that it becomes much more elaborated. It becomes like a big cantorial virtuoso singing. Let me just show from Kachka what the page looks like. I don't want to sing it. It's not important right now, but look at this. It's this is one page from Kachko, and it's all black. And basically, what you see here, first of all, you just see the variation, the coloraturas, the ornamentations, the melismas, etc. There's a big extension of the range. In other words, here, I don't know what the expectation from a layperson to do, but the range is much higher. You see all this ornamentation. You see even some chromatic changes. In other words, much more freedom, very virtuoso. Actually, the sources that I checked, I saw a varying degree of virtuoso. Sometimes it's not really that elaborate, but even in those cases, you can definitely see visually that it's different from the rest of them in that sense. You see a little bit more. What I found, again, I guess that was not recursively already, that I knew what to look for, how the motifs can express themselves in a recitative like this, and for that, Sulzer is the greatest example, and again, in our school, that's not my choice, I don't teach that, but they do. They teach that as a model. Unfortunately, most of the students forget it and they go back to the norm, the practice, which sometimes is saying information, etc. I know that Eli Schleifer is also familiar with that. One time we did a presentation together and I performed it. But here I'm not going to explain the motif. I can sort of hum through it, mark through it, but you'll see the motifs as they appear. אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, רצה במנוחתנו, קדשנו במצוותיך, ותן חלקנו בתורתך. I'm kind of messing up the words, but anyway. שבענו מטובך, ושמחנו בישועתך, וטהר ג'י ליבנו בעודך באמת, והנחילנו אדוני אלוהינו סליחה באהבה וברצון שבת קודשך, וינוחו בה ישראל מקדשי שמך. And the bracha baruch ata Hashem, ברוך הוא שמו, מקדש השבת. So you see that even we have the finales on 5 and we have the approach. And so here is a sort of more tame cantorial I want to say fantasia, but that's wrong. Cantorial rhapsody, and it shows that the mode still is alive here, except more freedoms, and the motifs are sort of far in between. There's a little bit more stuff in between to fulfill that, and they don't necessarily show us the strict patterns that we saw in the phrases in Magen Avot. This is basically all I have to say now. The only transition, I transition to Amalia in a second, but we have to realize that then we can go back and check all the other places that in all these different sources, and they put a lot of different things in there as belonging to the mode, and we can check them, and I did, and they're not even close to resemble this. And so from this, we can also sort of do the recursive, both negative and positive. Negative, not all the sources that are mentioned in the previous discussions are Magen Avot. And the positive, we do have a clear picture of what Magen Avot is, but it's only limited to this. In other words, here they follow the categorization in which the defining liturgical unit of the mode is time occasion. The time Friday night, actually the time and occasion are Friday night, I guess you can say Ma'ariv, and the part of the repetition, the quasi-repetition of the Chazan. Again, so now we'll take it again to Amalia, because I'd like to emphasize again that this is just one particular model that works for here. We don't necessarily expect it to work somewhere else, although in Adonai Malach it's very similar, that there's a little bit more freedom, but it can give us sort of a model into how to look into other things. That all of them, I said last week, are part of a sort of an open-ended framework. Amalia?
Yes. Thank you. Now you can drink some water. Okay, so I think in terms of time, we're good. We're it's 8:23 here. So what you see here is we saw an example of how to take a section of the liturgy that had the name Magen Avot and analyze how it works. And I think it's, again, worthwhile stressing that we're not talking only about a scale and not only about motifs, and the motifs are what Boaz called motif types. They have a function, it's not just a sequence of notes, and it's important to see how they function. And also this, actually the last factor that Boaz added just right now at the end was the fact that we're looking at a section of the liturgy in a broader look, that we look at also at the structure of the text and how the music is set on that text and different paragraphs. And sometimes the section would be maybe only a few paragraphs, sometimes it would be broader. But we have to take that into consideration, and we can't just say, okay, this is Magen Avot, and this is Avarba, and this is Hashem Alach. We have to look a little bit further in and in more details in order to understand what does belong to a certain mode and what doesn't. And one of the questions that was risen here last time, and I could sympathize with it also as a teacher, and whoever tries to teach this system or use it, teach students how to use it or explain it, wants to have an idea what are we going to say, what are we going to teach the students if the previous attempts to define the system were not good enough. So first of all, we're doing the best we can, but maybe we should take this model and look at the different sections of the liturgy in the closer look and see, maybe say what it isn't. So if you talk about Magen Avot, then if you look at Ishtabach, for example, that was mentioned also under this umbrella of Magen Avot, it shares the same scale, it shares maybe some of the motifs, but it behaves differently. So there's work to be done in order to define how exactly it works in Shacharit Shabbat, from Shochen Ad through from Nishmat through Shochen Ad, Ishtabach, etc., to understand how exactly the motifs work there and if they are stable. And in any case, it behaves differently. It does not behave as those motifs and those notes behave in Magen Avot on Friday night. We could also...
So,
yeah?
No, I didn't mean to stop you. Go.
Okay, and then if we look at other modes that we're familiar with, we can already say a few things about them as well, even though the thorough, detailed work of explaining exactly which motifs belong to the mode and which don't, and how they work, and which is a core model of those sections from the Mest's variety of examples that we have and documentation that we have. So which is an exemplary manifestation of the mode. Still, we can say, we can generalize about Hashem Alach, for example. It's much more varied than Magen Avot, which is so very particular. It also appears in a variety of sections of the liturgy. You can find it in Hallel, you can find it in Baruch She'amar and in Rosh Hashanah, and you can find it, but in different places, it will have different levels of freedom, for example. And still, you can say it's more scalar, like it has this, what we saw before, this graphic presentation of what belongs to Hashem Malach, and also say that in various sub-traditions of Ashkenazi sub-traditions, the use of Hashem Malach may not be exactly the same, meaning not all the same, all the text will be used with Hashem Malach in some sub-traditions will be used with Hashem Malach in others, but when it appears, Hashem Malach will be basically the same mode. Again, it's a different, it's another presentation, another effort, research effort, to find exactly how it works in Hashem Malach. We already have material on that, but that will not be today. If we talk about Ahava Rabbah, for example, if you look at Magen Avot on one side, the Ahava Rabbah will be probably more on the other end of the scale, meaning it's much closer to the definition of a scale than a mode, because again, it's the level of freedom is very high, and sometimes it's just enough to have that tetrachord with a the major second or the augmented second in order to have Ahava Rabbah. So and then when you look at different sections of the liturgy, you can say this is close to, okay? So we have you will find similar motifs, but then you have to check if they work separately from other motifs that belong to the same mode, or maybe they're cross-repertory. Boaz has done a lot of work on cross-repertory motifs that appear in different places. So you have to be careful before you relate any certain motif to a mode. I mean, there's a lot of theoretical work here still to be done. Maybe the main point is applying this mode of analysis to other sections of the liturgy. You can try it, or we should all try it. The point is not to impose any model on other parts of the liturgy. Try, see if it works, if you can identify motifs and modes of performance, and maybe textual principles that govern the mode of performance, and then go back and see if it works. Okay, we can incorporate it into the model, and if it doesn't, maybe try something else. I saw there were some levels of confusion in the beginning here. I hope this made a little bit more sense now that we're at the other end. And Boaz, if you want to add anything before we open the floor for questions.
I'll just add in terms of the differences between, first of all, the motif types. Even the same motif type could behave differently in different liturgical contexts in terms of, the freedom in which we extract it. They could relate in different ways to the text. They could relate in different ways to each other, and they function in a different role. Again, how it's all sewn together. So it really requires a lot of similarity to say this is the same mode. By the way, and the other thing is that I already know, I've explored a bunch of this repertoire. Some of it are published, some of them not, and some of them are better defined than others. Some of them have, just a sub-tradition that behaves in a certain way, and all the others, who knows. So I have a relatively clear idea about most of what I said, this open-ended framework. And again, I guess the Adonai Malach and Magen Avot are here. Avalba is pretty close. Again, Amalia said that, but the idea is that because it's a cause and effect, because it can rely just on one pentachord to make you feel that you're in Avalba, it has much more freedom. I just want to pose that the scale of Avalba, if we really want to be true to the reality, would also become a monster like I showed. But the scalar element, the pentachord, that's just playing up and down, will give you the flavor. But again, unlike other cultures that may have the same scales, Avalba in Judaism behaves in a different way. We have some, again, the motif types are different, the parameters are different, the connection to the text is different, but we have some. And that also sort of puts some kind of at least answer to, we have the same scale in, I guess, not just in Romania, in India, etc. But no, it's not the same. In Makam, first of all, has a different tuning system. And I do this exercise, listen to a Makam Taksim and then compare it. And you can actually analyze the Taksim in different way. But it says that, even the scale is not the same. But even if it were, everything else behaves differently. Just one more thing, and it goes to Geraldine as well. I just saw the last comment that was, I think Alex said that we have to write it down, otherwise in 300 years we'll have to do it again. I have written down a lot of it. Again, there is much more to do, and I'm sort of struggling with the sort of need to put something together, which I'm struggling with this even mentally. But I'm going to give Geraldine about 16 articles that I have that sort of cover different territories. First of all, the Adonai Malach the Magen Avot is covered, although it's old and it needs some tweaking. The Adonai Malach is really new, and I actually incorporate some of the observations on the system in there. All of them are available online. Geraldine, you can find all of them in academia.edu, but some of them have their links. But yeah, I think, I wrote them, so might as well have somebody read them and perhaps incorporate them, including people who teach or people in other fields of musicology, to understand that we don't have to just stay outside and say this is too much to handle. You just have to handle it in a very specific way. And yeah, it's tedious, it's hard work, and you have to go into the details, and you cannot come to it with preconceptions. You can, but you have to be careful that you correct them if you find out that they don't work. Okay, I guess we can open it.
Maybe you want to unshare or stop the share screen, and maybe Geraldine, do you want to run it, or a few people want to raise their hands? We can't hear you, Geraldine. You need to unmute.
All right. Thanks so much. So if you're happy, Amalia, to deal with the questions, that would be fine, or people could raise their hand if they want to say something. Sometimes you may have said something in the chat, but you may want to elaborate on that. It may have been covered already in what people have said. So
While you do something, I can sort of check the chat briefly.
yeah, I'll tell you about your articles. We have published some of them, or put the links to them on the website next to the talk, and we also distributed the links when we wrote about it. But you can always go to the Humanities Commons site for COZ 36 and 37. You'll see some of Boaz's articles. And Boaz, if you want to give us links to any others, we'll put them with the report of the session. Robert Brody is very kindly writing a report, and Charles Heller wrote a little report from last week. So we're trying to keep up with it. And, as Alex says, we don't want to start all over again. You've done so much. We want to capture that. But of course, who knows what synagogue music will sound like in 300 years' time?
I just want to say, first of all, yes, some of them I don't have links. If I just give you the titles, a list of the titles, because even the titles that I don't have links for, they're all on a website. It's called academy.edu. I'll write that again. And in terms of the practice, Amalia mentioned that there is a tendency. I think it's yes, there is people takes different freedom, etc. But I think that this sort of opens the option, first of all, when you teach it, to sort of, if we talk about, the tradition is lost, etc., we can go back to it. The next step, again, which certainly don't cover it, but this could be the base of all, I have some of it in one article, of taking it a step further to see how this structure actually affects the liturgical experience itself, how it creates a certain very specific cognitive emotional frame of mind, and also shaping the experience in a specific way. You cannot do it without the theory first. I just want to say that some of the articles tackle other very, very different mode of norm of conduct of the music. Some of them do have scalar issues and different things happen in different ambiti, etc. So you have a taste of some of the others. But yeah, the basics. Also, my first article on Avaraba, there are a few things I really have to take back. But I'm planning at some point to write the same thing in more details about Avaraba as well. And we'll talk about the technicalities, but I think, again, it would be nice if my work gets read, but I think it can actually be helpful in terms of teaching it and retaining this very involved tapestry of experiences and expression. So I'm done. No, I'm done.
Please raise your hand or your virtual hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Eliyahu, unmute. Can you unmute?
Okay. I want to thank Boaz and Amalia for this very, very interesting and presentation. I must say that if you really want to go deep into Boaz's analysis, then you must read the article on this Magen Avot mode. Although you claim, Boaz, that it is an old article, but it's still valid and valuable. And I think that there you can find the details that you can look at your leisure. And here we had a little bit of a race of the evidence, and therefore I think that the article is a must, and one has to really read it in order to go deep into it. I want to say something about Edelson. I am also have my critique about Edelson, and everybody, you thrive today on criticizing Edelson. The musicology just develops very well by contradicting Edelson, and that's very good sport. And it is also true. In other words, Edelson was a pioneer, and as a pioneer, he made some mistakes, or he had some misconcepts of things. But I want to say something about his article on the Magen Avot mode. His article on the Magen Avot mode did not intend to analyze the Magen Avot mode, although he mentioned something about structure of the Magen Avot mode. The idea was to prove to everybody, I'm not sure that he was successful, but the idea was to make it the mother of all modes in Jewish music. To say that historically this mode preceded everything else in Jewish music. And in order to do that, he used the techniques of his time in what was called at that time comparative musicology. In that, just a minute, let me finish. In comparative musicology, in which he tried to show that there are similar modes and similar patterns of music which belong to various old cultures, and the Jewish music is one of them, and therefore this is the oldest kind of mode. It is also the simplest kind of mode, etc. Boaz, you wanted to react?
Yeah, I mean, we covered all of this last week, and so I just want to, if we have time, to use it for something that may matter here.
I listened to. I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend last week, but I listened to it, and still I thought that is a comment that we need needs to be said. Now, as to the chain of tetrachords for the scale of Hashem Malach, of course, the problem of scale is there all the time, and what is scale and what does it mean? And if you look carefully at the Hashem Malach mode, you see that it doesn't go according to this scale necessarily. In other words, the important tones are not necessarily the pivot tones that are marked by these tetrachords. And for instance, there is a great emphasis on Hashem Malach on the fifth degree, and the fifth degree is not represented in this kind of chain. So what we can learn from this is that there is something about the interaction of the scale as it is, and the scale as it is shown by these tetrachords, and the actual usage of this scale. And you can say that maybe there is a conflict there, but this is part of the game of the entire system of Hashem Malach mode. That it say that it takes ideas from various cultures, various functions of the scale, and then there is this kind of discrepancy, and the discrepancy is also very, very important to note. But that does not mean that this chain of force, which, by the way, Joseph Yasser was the first one to discuss it. He discusses in terms of chains of Mixolydian modes, Mixolydian scales. That it is doesn't have any value. It has a value, but it has to be just juxtaposed with against, let's say, the actual uses of the modes. And about the modes itself, you're right that as we're going up, we're going into more what we call minorization of the mode. But I must say that when cantors sing Migdash Melech, they don't sing it in the highest part of the scale. They sing it low, in C minor instead of C major, so to speak. So they don't use necessarily that part of the scale which is high, but they turn the major into minor in order to see the sing about the destruction of the temple, etc., the raising from the ground, etc. And then the idea of singing Vayechulu in public, I don't think that ever happened before the second part of the 19th century. In other words, what we still have in various congregations, and you pointed out rightfully, that the Chazan begins Vayechulu Hashamayim ve'aretz, and then the congregation mumbles it in what I call a modal cloud, and then the Chazan repeats the certain part of it from, say, Vayichal Elohim Bayom HaShvi, or Vayivarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi, etc. This was the standard. And in the 19th century, when the idea of congregational singing started to bud, and the Chazan sang, and the congregation sang with him, and you can see the great difference between Zulzer's Vayechulu and Lewandowski's Vayechulu. And Zulzer's Vayechulu, no congregation could sing. It was not meant for the congregation. It was meant for the Chazan. It is indeed very virtuosic, but Lewandowski already has this idea. And after Lewandowski, and I don't know, some research has to be done about it, but I believe that it's quite possible that Lewandowski was the first one, and everybody imitated him after that, to make it a congregational song. And quite clearly, imitations of Lewandowski's are there even in the Ephros piece, and also in Israel Goldfarb's Vayechulu, which became fashionable among American congregations. And you see the elements of Lewandowski there in variation. So what we have today in the Vayechulu is a more congregational rendition of the piece. And indeed, you're absolutely right about the development when you go to Eloheinu v'Avotenu Etzei v'Menochatenu. It's absolutely right. But your analysis of the motives is really very, very good and useful, and we can use it in instruction of the pieces. The only thing is what is not so clear, and you mentioned it yourself, is this kind of waves that go down. How do they really go down there? I'm sure that you would like to do some more research of the thing. So these are my little notes, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Baruch Cohen, you wanted, before you come back, Boaz, Baruch, do you want to say something? You can unmute.
Now you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Basically, from what I heard today, I'm sorry I wasn't here last week, but what I heard today, I want to congratulate the participants on the work they are doing on really on Nusach, because back in 1950, when I wrote the article for the Musicological Society on the structure of the synagogue prayer chant, this was habit, you know, we were all in the habit of davening this way. And since then, of course, it's been, summer camp music time. So I'm glad to see this happening, that we're really getting back and mastering the original, authentic Jewish tradition.
Thanks, Baruch. Charles Heller, did you want to unmute and say something?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. And it's very nice you just asked me just after Baruch Cohen, one of the Arbad Bonim in the musical Haggadah. So following on from what Baruch Cohen just said, that he drew attention to the fact that what was people just instinctively knew in the 50s is something that now we have to work harder. And I'm just going to throw this out as an image. Imagine what you have, you'll kind of recreate an extinct species. And so what you have to do is get its DNA. So you find a mammoth, you dig up a mammoth in Siberia, and you try your best to extract the DNA. You hope you've got the right DNA, and you hope you've got it all, and you try your best to reconstruct and bring back to life the mammoth as a living species. So this is what we're trying to do here. Wouldn't it be simpler if we preserved the species while it was endangered before it became extinct? And that's what I want you to think about. I came up with an idea, and I've called it the Society for the Preservation of Nusach. It consists of two people, me and I forget who the other one, I think Daniel Tunkel is the other member. So he's the treasurer. So the thing is, what I have in mind, I don't know how we're going to do it, so I just throw it out. All I've come up with is the title. What we need to do is somehow encourage those people who still daven somewhere where there is actually Nusach to somehow maintain it. And then we won't have to, all this analysis is vital and it has to be done. And yasher koach to all the professors who are working on it, Boaz and everybody else. But the bottom line is, if the species becomes extinct, then forget it. So we have to find a way. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Charles. Geraldine, 1 minute. I saw Jerry wants to speak, but I know that Benny wanted to say something, and he didn't have a chance. Benny Meisner, last time. Can you unmute? I know he needs to leave. So Jerry, if you're willing to wait 1 more minute. Benny?
Unbelievable. I just want to tell you that it's much better to be a zanav le'arayot than rosh le'shualim, because it's amazing. However, I'm not a theoretician. I was amazed how I maneuvered through this discussion through a career of davening nusach in an Orthodox, conservative, and Reform synagogue. all I know that from the Viennese Benjamin Unger and Shlomo Ravitz and the greatest of all, Leib Glantz and Alter and Genshoff, all of them said the motifs are motifs. We never talked about the scale. Later, Avery and Ben Belfer. I know that Joe Levine and I once spoke about the fact that in a Magen Avot on Friday night, you use the upper tetrachord. And the Shochenad, or the Tefillah mode on high holidays, or other, and Genshoff used to always say that you bring the Misheberach motif in there, the Ukrainian Dorian. I learned one thing from listening to Leib Glantz for 10 years, from the age of 10 until 20, that you maximize the scale and the intervals of each motif to the utmost capacity. And even as an example, in my later years here with David Bagley always had one little twist which didn't seem it belonged to that particular motif. And something that didn't belong. And I know that from studying lately the score of my uncle Israel Alter, he used the mode and the motifs betzimtzum for the students. But all the cantos that I set at their feet used the motifs to the maximum capacity and innovated. In our synagogue, in our community, we have one very, very, very talented cantor, Simon Spyro, who is really incredible. And I asked him once, whenever I do some improvisation, why do you always come back to the tonic? He said, because our mother tonic is in our ear. No matter what mode it is, our mother tonic is in our ear. And give you an example. I don't know how I arrived it until I dissected it, and I really have to go because I have a very important meeting. Actually, I'm looking for a job so I can start resting a little bit. If I do Ava Rabba, Ki El Poel Yeshuadata in E Fregish, I have to get out to G major for Shema Israel. And I didn't realize that I always used to do the lower seventh to get into it. And that's how I used to, but I never thought about it until later years. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you how incredible these sessions are. And I hope one day I'll have a chance to contribute something too.
Thank you. Jerry?
Hello. Well, I'm honored to even talk in the presence of such great musicologists. I'm not one, but I I wanted to mention in the book about Leib Glantz, The Man Who Spoke to God, on page 329, there's an article called The Musical Basis of Nusach HaTfilah. It's a keynote address to the 5th annual convention of the Cantors Assembly in 1952. And I advise you to read it because he really puts out, I think for the first time in the Cantors Assembly, such a elaborate explanation of how he understood Nusach. And I'd like to mention that Boaz, Tarsi, in the same book, made a beautiful essay called Music Theory as an Expression of Musical and Extra-Musical Views Reflected in Leib Glantz's Liturgical Settings. I want to say that this is a very interesting conflict of views between Tarsi and Glantz, which is very helpful to understanding any effort to theorize Jewish liturgical music. So I recommend looking at that article, those two articles, and thank you so much for this beautiful program. I learned a lot, and I hope all of us did.
May just a quick one. first of all, Jerry he showed a lot of integrity because my article was somewhat critical and it did not stop him from publishing it, even though it's in order of your father. And I really appreciate you giving me the chance. I also want to mention that there was a follow-up to this because I think the year after, Wahlberg started to argue with him, and Wahlberg brought his own motivic patterns, and Glass was basically talking about scales. He was not that concerned with the motifs, but Wahlberg, and then Yasser, I think, had Bikitsur. Those guys started a whole argument about a lot of things, and it was all published in one volume of the Journal of Synagogue Music, if I recall. Somebody just took all the presentations and the letter and the arguments and put it in the Journal of Synagogue Music. So it's really kind of interesting and somewhat amusing to read it.
If there are any more questions, I think we're at the end of the session. I just want to say one thing. I think what we're aiming, or what we're trying to suggest here, is something that I have learned from my teacher, Professor Eliyahu Schleifer, 23 years ago already, when I was I don't remember, it was a bachelor degree still, at the Hebrew University, and I took the course Music of the Ashkenazi Synagogue with Professor Schleifer, together with my father, if you remember. He also came to these classes. And then there you presented to us those modes that we are discussing here already for 2 weeks, but you also suggested already then the idea of maybe reconstructing the system in the form of EDO modes, that there really is a mode of for every different tefillah. So you did not mention it here, and I think basically Boaz is striving to get there, to get a better definition of how the system works. It is an enormous enterprise because it's, I don't know if infinite. Boaz, you mentioned many times, this is a project for several people, for several lives. And I hope at least raising the attention to the danger or the changes in the tradition in terms also of the modes is also a big step towards preserving it, understanding it. I think this is it, and I think that's what this group is here for. Geraldine, are we wrapping it up now?
Yes, I'd like to wrap it up now. Alex, you wanted to say something quickly, Alex Klein. Unmute and quickly say something because we're running out of time.
I'm fascinated by these two sessions, and I think they're very, very important. But what is more important for me is how you take this into the synagogue and what our cantors do with it today and how you interpret it. Because there's so much confusion in the musical world or the Jewish liturgical world, what are they going to do with it? Each college, the JTS might teach something, HUC might, Hebrew University, etc., etc. So each college picks up its own way of interpreting what actually is the nusach and where it belongs within the service. What I see today is iPads used, where people are writing down the notes, pre-written. So how can this be authentic when you are conveying a mood? What I learned when I was a little baby from some of the greats to today is nusach starts, nusach ends. What you do in between is your interpretation of the tefillah, of the prayer, and that is the most important thing if you have the skills to be able to do that. But what you're teaching and how you teach it is determined from the research that you do and what you write down for the students to take with them into the synagogue. Am I correct?
Thanks, Alex. I think there's probably not going to be time to answer that question, but may I say that Charles, instead of having a Nusach Preservation Society, why not start a Nusach study group that people who really have something to contribute and to answer those questions, Alex, of what are we going to do with it when we can actually say what it is? Because we want, as Charles has said, to preserve the animal before it becomes extinct. So if everybody's happy,
Geraldine,
leave it on
one
that
second.
note.
Geraldine, could you mention the program, the night program that's coming up on the 7th and 8th of April?
Well, why don't you mention it now?
Okay. In connection with Yom HaShoah, the Cantors Assembly and the European Cantors Association are staging a Zoom of the night Holocaust concert that took place in Hanover, Germany on January 27th, 2020, before 3,600 audience. And a lot of the people that participated in this event are going to speak about it, and we're going to play almost all of the music of Leib Glantz and Elie Wiesel's Night, which was acted out, narrated by a very, very famous German movie actor, Sebastian Koch. I'm sure a lot of people know him. And of course, with English subtitles. It'll be a really amazing program.
Okay, we will. Thank you, Jerry. We will let you all know about this. I'm just going to tell you that next week we can relax after this really intense double session, which again, we thank Boaz and Amalia so much for. It's been really important and really important to do it in this forum. And I hope that you will collect now a few really people who want to take it forward and help you and work with you to make a study group on how to deal with this. So next week we have a composer in focus, and we're talking, Jeff Janesco is going to talk to Bruce Adolph, I believe that's how we pronounce his name. And that should be very, very fascinating. He's an amazing musician and thinker and speaker, and that should be really good. And the week after that, Edwin Cerruti and Courtney Blue, who he mistakenly said was Courtney Love, are going to talk to us about new perspectives in Ladino song. So there's plenty to look forward to. And from cantorial music, Jeremiah Lockwood is bringing on Meir Baruch Kohn, who is one of the Hasidic cantors, to talk about him and his son from the Brooklyn Satmar Hasidic community. So plenty to look forward to. And Boaz and Amalia, once more, our enormous thanks for this wonderful session and for your articles, which we've already distributed and you can see. And we hope to continue. Anybody want to just, Mark, have you got a final word, or you okay?
No, just a really big thanks to everyone, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.